Hello, everyone. I'm Kara. Welcome to today's live webinar, Securing the Future, How AI, Geopolitics, and Ransomware Will Affect the Future. We're thrilled to have you join in as we dive into the ever-evolving world of OT cybersecurity and explore strategies to protect critical systems and infrastructure. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our experts today. We have Roger Hill, our founder here at Hillstrong Group Security, and we have the legend Ron Gula from Gula Tech Adventures. I'm really excited about this webinar, and I'm so glad you're here. Remember, this is a live event, and we welcome questions and participation. So pop your questions into the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll do a Q&A at the end. Again, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your time with us. Roger, I'll turn it over to you so we can get started.
Hey, thanks, Kara. So I've been looking forward to this one. And if you're just tuning in, I'm sure you're tuning in to hear Ron, and I'm excited for this conversation. And if that didn't get you the topic we put up there, that should be a heck of a hook. So good morning, Ron. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to have you.
Good morning, Roger. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, likewise. So, Ron, you've got probably one of the more interesting journeys, the personal journey. And I'd like to just start with that because I think a lot of the folks watching today would just be really interested in hearing about that and maybe even getting inspired.
Hey, look, I appreciate that. A lot of my background is right place, right time. And I would like to think everybody who's tuning in is in the right place, the right time, because they're on the front lines of the cyber war, right? I mean, it's crazy, like how many different attacks that are going on that have to stop. And the front line is everybody on this call. So look, my background's really simple, right? Grew up in Syracuse, New York. I went into the Air Force. I was always a computer guy and I wanted to be a pilot. It didn't work out for me. I blacked out at like, low levels of G's and stuff like that. And, but I got into basically communications for the Air Force, read the book called The Puzzle Palace, and wanted to go work at the NSA. And I was there in the 90s, basically when information warfare and computer network offense and all these things were kind of going on. And that gave me a front row seat to like large scale IT systems, but how national security works, how cyber works. Nobody called it cyber back. It was information warfare and that sort of stuff. But I left and I got to go work at a Beltway Bandit, which is, I probably shouldn't say it like that, was BBN. There's the folks who, created the internet. And I got to rapidly produce products for the government, which was kind of cool. And, I had really lucky to have that front row seat. Next thing was a cloud company called US Internetworking. So this was literally a company in the late 90s, which had this innovative idea of hosting applications in a data center so you could, treat them like a SaaS offering. So I had a front row seat for that. Trying to, put it all in. I had chasing some hackers one day, had the idea to do a network intrusion detection system. My wife and I did Dragon, sold that to a company. That company, the guy who bought us, we started Tenable. Tenable was like a 16-year journey where we were auditing everything we could, everything from a router to a VM to a SaaS. And then, when it was time for me to leave, we started Gula Tech Adventures, which focuses on cyber investing, cyber philanthropy, and cyber awareness. We've done these grants to kind of get more people aware and involved with cyber. And we put about $100 million of our own money to work in cyber startups. And any chance we get to talk to frontline cyber fighters, such as the folks in this call, I just jump at that opportunity. But I also try to spend time in DC. We put a lot of effort into our YouTube channel and try to share as much of what's going on as possible. So appreciate the opportunity to kind of share that with folks. Hopefully it wasn't too quick or too deep.
So that was probably the fastest versions to something that really should be a book.
No, look, I appreciate the legend. If legends are created because they have this victory and some sort of great outcome, and we have not had a great outcome in cyber. So I'm really hoping folks on this call can make a difference, and that everybody realize that this struggle is. I mean, we're going to be fighting AI pretty soon, and not just Russia and China. So it's going to be really interesting times.
I think a lot of folks that are tuning in here, they're part of that OT security community, and it's really interesting to see how this community is really growing. especially kind of that post Stuxnet, right? And I think there's a lot of mission-oriented folks that are just driven to, solve some of these problems, and that's one of the reasons I just love that community so much. I think this environment and landscape is really, changing so much. One of the things that I was kind of curious about in the earliest days of Tenable, what was the problem that you wanted to solve? Was it a lack of visibility of vulnerabilities, or maybe walk us through that early ideation?
Yeah. So right now, when I look back on Tenable and I basically say, what problem are we solving? In the early days, it was really enterprise vulnerability management. Now,
Yeah.
when we started, we didn't have things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, where you have these frameworks of your assets, your defenses, look for intrusions, all that sort of stuff. You didn't even have things like, Center for Internet Security or PCI back then. So it literally was, what can we do to make the vulnerability management process an easier thing? And, when you go back to the early 2000s, Wi-Fi was something new. High-speed internet was something new. So being able to scale and do that and bring all that data, nobody had heard of big data back then or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
That was really the focus. And of course, Tenable, we had the base of Nessus, which was this great, vulnerability scanner that everybody wanted to audit everything. So we did everything from OT systems to routers to Windows to all this kind of stuff. So that was really the focus early on.
Looking more in the Gula Tech Adventures. I love that, by the way. What are some of the elements or learnings from that journey, working with a lot of startups? And I'm sure that you have actually had a personal journey there, having a lot of exits in terms of fine tuning that recipe of what works. Any insights you can really share, and what you look for and what the market needs?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And look, last name's Gula, Gula. I used to joke, and Roger, you're going to get this, I never wanted to name a company after me, but here we are, right? Look, coming out of Tenable, our focus was to invest in companies and solutions, both on the nonprofit side and the commercial side, that could really make a difference in the fight. And almost somewhat as an apology tour for Tenable, because if you ever used the product, right, we can tell you everything, but don't do anything, right? Tenable doesn't patch, doesn't change a config, doesn't stop stuff, but it's trying to be that single source of truth. So if you look at the kind of things we've invested in, stuff, I'll drop a bunch of companies here, but Automox does patch management, right? Trinity Cyber, inline, a full content inspection, attack removal, right? Stuff like Sention, does config management for Windows and browsers. Almost every one of our companies has some sort of thing that it does that's not necessarily based on AI or threats, but it does something to make things better from an automated point of view. And that's a really big thing that we're trying to look for. Now, along the way, we've really sort of struck a chord with the startup community, just talking about how you should be pitching things. And, so many people start a company, and I think that's great. And, we want to know, if you're solving a problem, what are the 5 things that questions that you need to ask? One is, what problem do you solve? 2 is, how do you solve it? 3 is like, show us some proof. 4 is like, what's your ask? Are you raising money, right? And then 5, what's your vision of success? You would be surprised. Even though I've done videos on this with hundreds of thousands of views and done tons of public, I still get pitches from companies. I got one today. You have to see my product to understand it. Well, if I have to see your product to understand it, I don't care if it's quantum entangled communications. If I have to see it to understand it, that means I can't describe it and I can't sell it. And surely it's not a problem that people are going to really care about. So in cyber, since you can't see cyber, right? We have Vault Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. We have all these things going on right now. There's no visible manifestation of cyber. It's really hard to then have a company where you're going to justify buying a service or a service, software as a service solution, from a business that can't see these things. So those are the big things that we've learned is we want automation to fix things. And, whatever we're doing, we got to be very specific about.
I was going to ask you about that video. I just ran across that video that I think you're referencing. about a week ago. It was you did some animation, and it was basically a pitch deck, and I think it was 5 slides.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting, and a lot of the from the old lean startup and all the startup templates you see, typically they're 8-10 slides, and I think that's an interesting angle of looking at just condensing it down to those 5 slides, and that's I think a really great message for a lot of the startups out there.
And it's tough because with the 5 slides, and this applies to anything, not just cyber, not just raising money, but like pitching a course of action at a company.
Mm-hmm.
Saying that you have a general advising you, no disrespect to the military, but just because you have a general advising you doesn't mean that your solution is a great solution. Just because you used to hack for the CIA, that's great. Thanks for your service. Doesn't mean you have a great, solution to do that. And a lot of people fall into those traps. Just because you got Gula Tech to invest in you doesn't mean you're going to be successful, right? I wish that was guaranteed, but to be honest, look, it's not, right? Markets change, people change, and so on. But yeah, I would encourage anybody who wants to learn more about stuff like that, not only check out those videos, but go to a local pitch competition, go to a startup, and just see how people pitch. And it's not like Shark Tank on TV. Like literally, when you see somebody pitching a cyber product and you're a cyber practitioner, you need to imagine yourself sitting in those chairs at Shark Tank. Would I buy this product? And you need to put yourself in that situation, because if you're not getting those pitches, you're not going to recognize that the next best technology solution that comes in that you could use to your advantage.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's really good insight. And speaking of change, all right, let's go ahead and move to the big hype curve, right? I think I was telling you earlier that, about a year and a half ago, when the whole buzz around AI was really taking off, I think personally, I was frustrated with it. I felt like a lot of people were just really conflating ML versus AI and just putting everything into this big, broad bucket. But things have really, really progressed. And, AI is unlike, I can now say, it is unlike any other hype curve that I have ever experienced personally, from the .coms through cloud to anything else. And I'm sure you probably have your own opinions on that whole AI craziness right now.
Yeah, it's insane, because what AI has done is it's captured the imagination of the general public in a way that, IT or maybe Apple fanboys, whatever kind of tech you want to pick, just really hasn't done that. But there's a lot of issues going on here. So look, the first one is, when you look at AI's usage in other things, or just talk about technology advances, look at the advances we've had in healthcare that people can readily see. We've got COVID vaccines, we've got weight loss, we've got, we're on the precipice of a cure for cancer. If you look at something like animation, one of the reasons I'm so into animation, because I use AI for that, right? I can simulate a voice, I can take an actor and move them, and I can kind of convey a message with a video, and it really keeps me upfront. When I started in doing the animation stuff, the breakthroughs that they've had are just insane. The amount of videos I've been able to put out with just by myself. Now I would then pause and say, what advances have we had in cybersecurity? We really haven't, right? You might have said, look, the cloud is an advance, being able to go from on-prem servers and data centers to maybe ephemeral, API-based Lambda kind of stuff. That's a pretty significant shift. But aside from that, what cyber advances have been there? Better cryptography, better patching, sandbox for malware. And it's tough. Now, that's a little unfair, because in cyber, we're constantly judging how good we are by how good the threat is. And pretty much those guys have kept neck to neck this whole time. So even though there's been a lot of advancements, like, Halcyon has one of our investments in an anti-ransomware company, they have basically kernel armor, right? The stuff that Trinity's doing with their full content inspection is basically, I think, 10, 15 years ahead of anybody's packet analysis that's out there. But in our market, when I start selling like that, I start selling like a vendor, right? And it's not something that kind of captures this imagination that's out there. But the example I use is like an animation. I can take a person, put them at the end, have a conversation, say walk to the door. I have yet to see a cyber vendor that can say, I've got all your vulnerabilities. I got your org chart. I've also looked at the emails of all in your Slacks of all your communications. And based on all that, here's how I recommend you approach being CMMC compliant. Or here's how I recommend you approach being, it's not there. And I don't know if we're ever going to get there because there's no consistent data that we can train an AI on to have that insight to do that. It's just not, everything there on the cyber side is basically conversational and not actionable. So are we going to get there? I do think we're going to get there, but it's going to happen when we start replacing people with AI agents and not necessarily augment people with better threat data and artificial analysis.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes, and I've mentioned this before, and it just really resonates with me, is AI is not going to replace you. What's going to replace you is another human that knows how to use AI. It really is a force multiplier in so many different areas. One of the personal struggles I think I've had with it in terms of that OT lens, if you will, is the right data inputs that those LLMs can really be trained on, especially the fine tuning to have that type of insight, because that's one of the fundamental flaws, I think, within OT. It's the lack of getting the data. If you look at a lot of the different tech stacks right now that are ingesting, and they're doing some good things, right? But we have inherent limitations on the technical architecture of our industrial networks, right? So when you think about these, the packet sniffers that are just sitting there ingesting network traffic and looking for bad things, great. That's really good. But then you have to understand, are you getting 100% of the data? If you're not getting that full picture. And that's one of the challenges with the way our industrial networks are designed. The fact is, at closer to the critical control layer that is controlling the equipment, right? In those localized control cabinets, we're still seeing dumb switches, dumb L2 switches that don't have the capability of getting that packet stream, right? And that's the challenge, and that's the most critical layer. So this is the problem I see with AI in the space, is just having the right data to really train these models.
I think that's well said, and there's still a lack of understanding context and risk, regardless if you have AI or not. So, let's talk about OT, right? So Tenable had a big OT practice. We introduced passive monitoring because active scanning was an issue for some folks. But look, the reality is the biggest threat right now to OT is China, right? We've got all the typhoons going against the routers and the offline power generation, water, whatever, and it's a trust and professionalization issue. So when I meet people who pump water for a living or make power for a living, I start asking them, like, how do you feel about your cyber, right? It used to be like, can you demonstrate compliance? Now I ask, would you be willing to testify at your state capitol that China is not in your thing? And man, you want to see a CISO shrivel?
Yeah.
No, I don't want to do that, right? Well, you just told me all this stuff's really good. Why do you not want to tell the people of your state or your county how good you're doing? And of course, it's a political issue and that sort of thing. But at the same time, you don't need AI to tell people that, look, the biggest threat right now is this deluge of 0 days going against admin interfaces and VPN interfaces of routers, firewalls, and VPN servers, right? So where is like the simple message that says, do you have anything internet facing on your OT side? Turn that stuff off. And that should be like a really basic thing that we're communicating, and it just gets lost in the in the deluge of everything else that we're tracking in cyber.
I've definitely viewed the larger story for OT security. Starting, I think it really started from that post Stuxnet, commercially, if you will, and in that first wave. It was really the evangelism wave. It was folks trying to, hey, wake up, wake up. There's really a problem here. And I think we went from that right into this shiny object syndrome. The first dedicated, tech startups focused on the problem, and it was great. And that's great for the ecosystem and everything else. I've talked about this before too. I think we're also emerging out of this wave now where I think boards are more cyber aware, and they're saying, hey, where's the return on this investment? Because we've done things like we've had users purchase technology and then try to determine how to build a program around it. Not the way you should actually be approaching it. So I think that's kind of a challenge is thinking about where are we going? What is this next wave? And I think it's in terms of AI, it's really interesting because let me take a step back now. When I look at some of the automation vendors, the big ones, and the fact that they're leveraging code generation or the code generation of your industrial automation for programming HMIs and SCADA, wow, that's a leap that we could have maybe imagined 6 months ago, right? So
yeah, I mean, it's again, where AI is important, and we'll talk about that. But the role of cyber people, both in OT and IT, is becoming much more this custodian of enabling business to do things secure and trying to do the best with what you have. So, for example, let's say your OT stuff is connected to the internet.
Mhm.
Well, great. So then, what are your tools to protect it? Well, you have cyber hygiene, right? You have authentication, access controls, malware analysis, all this kind of stuff, right? And what's state of the art in that? Well, state of the art is doing the basics and also regularly monitoring how do you know what you know. So if you're monitoring your network, you have EDRs out there, you have packet sniffers, you have threat feeds and all this kind of stuff. How do you know that all that's working? So there's a new category called CTEM. I'm going to blank on the CTEM, but basically where you implement stuff like your own Typhoon, your own Vault Typhoon, and you literally fire it up once in a while and you make sure your stuff is detected in the same way that airplanes have multiple ways to measure altitude, airspeed, and direction and whatnot. But on the other side, there's these other strategic things you can do. Now in OT, we have a lot of air gap systems. Now I say air gapped, they are crypto gapped, maybe they're serial line gapped, maybe they're one-way gap. There's a lot of ways to gap something. But the thing to realize is that they're separating from this radioactive content that's on the internet. The radioactive content could be the next web query. It could be a payload in a PDF. It could be a random admin who's been phished, that kind of thing. But if you crypto gap that, separate it on a separate 5G network, all that kind of stuff, OT people know that this works really, really well, and you don't have a lot of things. What becomes important then? Understanding your vendors. Understanding is this new piece of software introducing a risk. I love passive monitoring. There's a lot of OT networks out there that, you know what, I'm not going to plug a sniffer into this OT network because you've just added one more component that might fail. And maybe I can just get the monitoring I need from SFlow for my switches. I'm not going to do spanning, right? These are all valid decisions. What I think is going to happen though, is that the lessons from the OT industry are going to creep over to the IT industry.
Really?
And when you start looking at, gee, can I use this AI app? Is this AI app going to consume data from my organization and give it to Microsoft, give it to a competitor?
Mm-hmm.
How do I prevent that? Well, you could try cyber hygiene, but probably not, right? Trying to filter and preventing people from getting to ChatGPT is a little bit difficult, right? So what can you do? You can separate your networks. You can use zero trust networking. You can put everybody on a separate 5G. You can put everybody on a separate, I call them cryptographed, stealth overlay networks. But the point is you can have a segment of IT where you have communications, you have computation, you have storage, but it is separate from the prying eyes of Google, from the prying eyes of OpenAI, from the prying eyes of your competitors. And I think AI is going to drive a lot of that because we just don't know at the end of the day, even if you're monitoring all those EULAs of everything you're buying, you just really don't know who's taking the data that you're sending it to. And then what happens when somebody like a Microsoft does get compromised by China and they're just beating on the APIs and getting access to your stuff without any loss? It's really going to be interesting to have the lessons from the OT people applied to IT and have segmentation out there.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting perspective, Ron. I hadn't thought of it that way. One thing that's really interesting to me is here we are. It is 2025, right? Yeah. Um, the reality is you go walk into a lot of these global manufacturers and other industry sectors, and we're still seeing some of just the basics where a certain percentage of their sites don't even have that separation between the IT and OT. So, it's one thing I can't help but I always cringe a little bit when I hear that word or that phrase air gapped, because I've never seen one, but I get your point about the, different elements or ways
It's the idea is, in the DoD, we have SCIFs, right? Where we actually segment everything, right? No electronic signals, only people with top secret clearances go in. Should everybody have one of those at their house? Absolutely not, right? That's not our risk model. Yeah. But, I would challenge you to take your work computer, on your home LAN and try to just make a separate VLAN between that and your home network where your Xbox is and your kid's malware is and that sort of thing, right? It's this kind of mentality that we need to have, that we just can't assume that everything's connected and we should just use cyber hygiene to protect things. Because time and time again, it's like, look, this one thing would have protected this attack. This one thing would have protected this attack. On the other hand, here's 100 things that they're not doing to enable that. So at least if we can teach people segmentation, that there's different types of segmentation, we're probably better off of protecting the data and what's critical to these organizations.
No, I 100% agree. Often I think where we're at is it's about doing some of the basics and do those basics well, right? And that's the people, process, technology. Because I think often if we look at, I think most adversaries, they're kind of like developers. I'll put my old developer hat on, right? Inherently, you're lazy. You're going to import libraries and functions and reuse. I mean that's kind of the point. So what you're going to do when you're looking to accomplish your mission, you're not going to go further than you have to accomplish that mission. And I think when you're looking at most of the threats coming from IT to OT, it's all networked, right? That represents the easy. So I think if we're looking at the strong segmentation and we're looking at good controls there, going further than just that separation, but maybe that industrial DMZ where we can actually segment off as that sandbox of the information sharing that's needed from the IT supporting infrastructure that supports your operations to that shop floor. So where the carpet meets the concrete, so to speak. That's one element, but I think it's we can't forget about the people and process side.
I mean, look, we can double down on that a little bit. Even an enclave of a factory that's got Wi-Fi and Ethernet, could that be physically penetration tested? Can you fly a drone over and join the Wi-Fi, right? So of course you have to do monitoring and do, but at some point, what is the minimum, or what does good look like in that case, right? If you're building Teslas, if you're building phones, or you're building Siemens PLCs, right? How hard are you supposed to work to make sure an adversary doesn't come in and put a backdoor in that stuff? How hard are you supposed to work and make sure that the person you hired doesn't work for China and is putting a logic bomb in there, right? At some point, there's this, it gets a little iffy, right? Whole nation, is it the intelligence community going to work with you and stuff? But we need to be cognizant of that. Now, at the same time, you go over to the IT side and you look at something like a phone. A lot of people have two phones. One phone is probably managed by the corporation with MDM, but you can probably still go to Facebook on it. You can probably still buy stuff from Amazon on it, right? The other phone's your personal phone. I think that second phone should be much more on a private 5G, private, crypto. It might use your home Wi-Fi, but it's only talking to the beacons that can establish the cryptographic connections to share proprietary information. We know how to build these things. You don't need to go buy a specific product to do it, but usually the will and leadership of these corporations you don't see people coming through with that. which is why I want to do stuff like this. I want to give people ideas of things they could do that would dramatically, give them uptime during a ransomware outage, during an audit, during that sort of stuff.
No, I think that's awesome. I think that really speaks to the good enough, but I like that idea of the separate 5G infrastructure, for example. One of the things that was really surprising, I was having a conversation with someone last week, and they had exited one of the very large oil and gas companies. And they were articulating a story how the engineering side, they had laid off much of the engineering and kept a bunch of the senior guys with some of the gray hair. And they're actually working on the orchestration of their models that they've built internally. And they've already made those decisions, and they're engineering their systems in that way. And that was a little bit mind-boggling, because to me, that means it's a little more a little earlier than I anticipated, because that was part of this discussion. This was a company that was never at the tip of the spear. So what is the current state of a lot of industry right now? It literally feels like an arms race. And
so the AI stuff is progressing so fast that I think what's going to happen is you're going to see corporations backfill people as they retire with AI agents. And I'm not talking like agents that do, but like a virtual HR agent, a virtual sales agent, virtual help desk agent, right? You're going to see that kind of stuff. Now, to date, we haven't seen that in IT because it just hasn't been reliable enough, right?
Yeah.
You can take a human. I can do this with a number of our products. I can write an implant with one of our breach and tax simulation companies is called Cype. Patch management is called Automox. I can use ChatGPT in both of those products to write scripts. I always tell people, do you want to write those scripts? Want to have them run on Friday before you leave, or maybe first thing Monday morning, right? That kind of cringes people, especially in IT. But I'm not talking about making that better. I'm talking about you can literally get a human level analyst to work in your SOC probably within a year, if not sooner. So if you start getting human-like intelligence, that again, it might not know the exact things about cybersecurity, but if it can reason like a human and learn, you're going to see corporations start using this, and you're going to get a reduction in human headcount to do that. Now that's a scary world, and it's also an amazing world. I kind of like it because, I think a lot of times, when you talk about politics and the economy and cyber, what is our goal? And my personal goal, I got a lot of science fiction stuff behind me. Like I want Star Trek. I want basically the ability to have anything I want, training, food, goods. I want it for free, basically, right? We want all of that stuff to be available to everybody. And the more we can make things free, the better off we are. On the other hand, though, if there's bias in that, if there's cost in that, if people are just going to keep the profits and not make things free, that's a very Blade Runner kind of world, and I don't really kind of want that. But the point for people on this call is not to kind of invoke science fiction imagery. Say, look, you need to be at the center of these discussions. When I talked before about deciding if you can or can't use ChatGPT or you need to be part of that AI governance that's being rolled out, because whether you're building your own AI or whether you're using somebody else's AI, whether it's for a cybersecurity function or for just monitoring water and stuff, you are still on the hook for it. And there's a case going on right now where Rite Aid rolled out an AI video monitoring for shoplifting detection, and it was a little bit too aggressive. In profiling people. You can imagine where that's going. And it's a big deal. Yeah, it's a very big deal for them. So look, and then the other thing is going to be like, look, if we can't do cybersecurity good, and somebody goes to the trouble of making a great AI that does something, that means someone's going to steal it. I can't come in and steal your people. I might be able to hire them away, but if I can come in and steal your AI, that's going to be a problem. Now, again, if your business is pumping water, I don't want to belittle that, right? There's a lot of people that we've been pumping water for a very long time. That might not be the best analogy, right? But if you're doing CAT scan analysis and the OT machines that are looking at that kind of stuff, or the embedded machines, that's kind of where I'm going, right? I think the more people take all their knowledge and put it into one point, it's going to be a lot easier for people to steal.
No, 100%. I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I was really intrigued to start following was the concept of the MCP, or the Model Context Protocol. I first heard of this maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and I think at that time that was one of the earlier part of that curve. Now we're looking at hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of these MCP servers, which gives it basically it allows these AI agents to, of course, have that context to be able to perform the multimodal outcomes. What blew me away, and literally this morning was the first time I heard about this one, was the A2A, or the agent to agent. And it's like, okay, wait a second, let's stop. The idea that you're going to have an AI agent and it's going to determine that it should be talking to another agent, and then they're making decisions based upon an outcome, that's getting a bit wild, even for Blade Runner.
It is. And look, I'm an algorithms guy. So I don't like the fact that I can ask an LLM, I run an LLM on my own system. I can ask it a question twice and I'll get 2 different answers. And that's concerning. And, it's also concerning that I could give you an LLM, you can download it off of Hugging Face and you might be able to see the data in it. But unless you train that new LLM with that data, you really don't know what's in that LLM. So one of the areas that I think we need more development on is trying to understand the LLMs. How are they thinking? What is the bias? How do you analyze the data that went into to train those things? Because if you're going to roll these things into your own systems, it's really questionable. Now, one of the companies that we use for the animation is called Replicant, and again with the Blade Runner reference, but it's got a K in it and whatnot. And they were one of the first people to tell me about DeepSeek, which is the Chinese LLM that was really efficient at what it was doing. And again, with the science fiction references here, in Matrix 2, when Neo fights Seraph, he's the Asian defender of the Oracle. He says, I have to fight you in order to know it's really you and you're not being fake and stuff like that. Well, with these LLMs, how do you actually understand them? So one of the things they did is they took a chatbot and they hooked one up to OpenAI's ChatGPT, and they took another one and they hooked it up to DeepSeek, and they literally had them start talking and going back and forth. DeepSeek immediately started coming up with questions about the OpenAI whistleblower who committed suicide. The OpenAI guy was asking DeepSeek stuff about Tiananmen Square and filtering and stuff like that. But you watch this for 30 minutes, and the number of cringe-worthy moments is just like, oh my gosh, how would I ever know this, right? And if you don't build your own AI, by the way, none of these AIs are that perfect right now. So if you're producing content for children, which is another thing the Replicant folks do, they constantly check the output of every AI against every other AI. That's kind of the best practice. Otherwise, I'm not even gonna. I got in trouble for making fake things, right? But Hitler's still alive, right? That kind of thing. That could come out from some with hallucinations and whatnot. So yeah, there's an awful lot going on there.
Yeah, listen, there's so much merit to the human in the loop here. One of my first journeys when I started, finally exploring AI, the Gen AI, I should say. Of course, I started with what I know best, the OT side. And one of the things that was really a nugget for me is I was getting some responses back that I felt like were so unique to my personal perspective of how I viewed and how I communicated melody. I'm like, wait a second, where did you get this? Right? And it was just such kind of mind blowing to realize that 90% of what I was seeing was actually quite good. 10%, oh wow, stop. Painful, right? Cringeworthy, and that's the hallucination side, or not even the hallucination. I think it's just bad information, because that's one of the challenges in our space.
It's interesting because on one hand, I'm advising people to do some sort of AI governance, and try to make sure they do some sort of AI that includes some sort of AI access control. And there's really two schools of thoughts on that, right? Is AI governance and AI access control just regular IT? At the end of the day, it's an app. If it's a local AI, it's just like a local database. Who can have access to it, right? We've got a whole industry that's doing that. On the other hand, is this so new and so transformative that you're going to do things like have the AI talk to every database you have, regardless of the access controls, and now you need an AI that can see if Ron can actually get the answer to the question he just asked. I'm not seeing that in practice. I don't know how much. We haven't done an investment there. There's a lot of great companies. Gnostic's a good company. There's a lot of different people out there who are working on that. But the one that I always see is I always get a demo of these AI monitoring for other AIs. Like, we can tell when the AI is hallucinating. Yeah. And I'm like, but what if you're hallucinating? What data are you training that on? And I just don't. It's moving so fast. I just haven't. It's sort of like when people criticize Microsoft for being insecure, not realizing that Microsoft has more cybersecurity people working for Microsoft, making their products as good, way better than anybody else. It's a big target. They have a lot to go. OpenAI is the same way. They're QAing the heck out of their stuff, way more than some. Occasionally the glitches happen, absolutely, but yeah, it's interesting times. And look, I don't think I've made this point yet, but if you're in and using AI, whether it's OT or you're on the IT side, whatever data you're looking at, you might be subject to a number of state regulations, right? There are no real federal guidelines right now for the use of AI data. But boy, if you look at California, if you have OT systems that are dealing with healthcare, well, if it's AI generated PII, it still might count as PII, even though it's like fake data and stuff like that. There's all sorts of regulations that are rolling out right now. You got to stay on top of that stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And just kind of go back to that hallucination point, and this is one of the epiphanies I had. I think it's the people in my age range that the experience that they've gained through a life of working with the different systems and building that knowledge, and all the mistakes that were made in those learnings. I'm definitely speaking for myself there. That having that ability to be able to look at this very quickly as that human in the loop and know what is good or what is false. What concerns me is the younger generation that hasn't had that experience, where on the surface it's much more binary. It's either good or bad, and it's always good, right? So yeah, that's a little bit of a concern for me.
Well, it goes into what are we teaching the AI? So just pick a basic example, right? If you want to teach an AI how to get a job, and you read all the job boards and all the job hunting pages, you would think that it's how you do your resume, how you apply, and what you do. Whereas, like, I think 80 to 90% of the jobs people get, it's who you know. But you're never going to see that on a resume site, and an AI is trained on that wrong data is not going to know that. Same thing with cybersecurity, right? If you read the NIST cybersecurity frame, if you read Center for Internet Security, how to harden that stuff, that's great. But a lot of times those things don't say, look, if you don't put your stuff in the cloud, you're not going to have a cloud hopper attack take your data, right? If you don't use 3 types of web browsers, you have 3 times less things you have to patch, right? So these high level things, segmenting your network and segmenting your network and whatnot, we're not teaching the people to do stuff like that, so the AIs aren't going to learn that. My concern, from a science fiction point of view, is that these AIs are going to have a freezing effect on progress. It looks like the next few AI iterations at OpenAI are going to be trained by the AIs themselves. It sounds like Colossus, the Forbin project, where at the end of the first movie, they start building a bigger, AI supercomputer and that kind of stuff. But if we don't have enough data to train the next levels of AI, yet we're going to have all of our positions sort of have AI in them, on one hand, that might level us up, but at the other hand, it might really freeze all progress, whatsoever in research. So it's a very weird time right now. There's a lot of risk with this technology.
I think there is. And, one of the things that probably concerns me the most around AI is around the business innovation. And when you're looking at such a force multiplier, and beyond the height curve right now that I think there's almost this arms race of adopting for the sake of innovation, for the sake of these business outcomes, without utilizing the known guardrails that we know we should have in place. That we're ignoring those guardrails for the sake of that shorter term business outcome and the fear of being left behind. And it's almost like a domino effect, and that's part of what concerns me right now. Is just, for example, going back to the code generation side. We haven't even tapped into the side of the aspect of AI being used by the adversaries to accomplish mission. And so I think, well, what's that famous Chinese expression? May you live in interesting times. Yeah.
May you live in interesting times. Yeah, and look, we have not seen, aside from the deep fakes, where I've actually was at a conference and somebody deep faked me just to show that they can detect the deep fakes and stuff. I'm not super concerned about that. Like, even though you could probably break into an enterprise, have, compromise somebody's single sign-on, and then produce a deep fake audio and stuff like that, we really haven't seen that happen, because most of the attacks that go on from a ransomware have a scale issue where they want to run these things all over the place, and we just don't have the GPUs to do that sort of thing. But from a theory point of view, nobody's had to update the NIST cybersecurity framework with new things because the AI threats are so big, or there's no new MITRE ATT&CK TTP that some AI kind of came up with and whatnot. Can AI help an offensive person? Absolutely. Has it been dramatic? Not really. I think our direct, probably most one there is in the phishing space. We have a company called Inky. They're probably, in my opinion, the most effective and efficient at detecting phishing email. So like the cost of detecting an email is cheaper than anybody else and better than anybody else. They had to introduce a local LLM, something that doesn't run in the cloud or doesn't have, like, not an API call to like OpenAI or Claude or something like that, because it was getting fairly sophisticated on the way in. They had to do semantic human reasoning of understanding what is the parsing of an email message. But you can't do it at the cost of, you can't just, these companies that pitch us and they just send every email to, ChatGPT, is this phishing? You're not going to make any money doing that, right? You're going to lose money, doing that stuff. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Listen, that's probably a really interesting way to kind of pivot to, from your perspective in really running a fund and investing in tech startups. What do you see as the trend? What are you looking for, the top 5 in cybersecurity in general? And then we can maybe double click on that into the OT side.
Yeah, so look, we get great pitches all the time, and it's a lot of different things. A lot of this is opportunistic, and we like to do a little bit of national security, a lot of cyber, some AI. I like to publicly talk about anybody who has ideas or technology to have that enclave system. Like, we're getting pitches from companies that make it easy to manage 5G private networks, for example, right? Maybe you can do the same thing with cryptography. Maybe it's a hardened phone, right? So anything in that enclave space, we want to talk to people. And the other thing that I'm really looking for is I want to see more companies audit the base LLM. In other words, I give you an LLM and you tell me what's in it, what the biases are and those things. There's a lot of research going on in that space. Yeah. Most of the tech that I'm seeing out there is basically fuzzing, where you're going to compare this week's query with last week's query for hallucination. Make sure your R stuff hasn't drifted, and that sort of thing. But aside from that, look, if anybody can dramatically change the cost and efficacy of doing cyber, we always want to hear from them. I really don't like companies that are 5% better. I constantly get pitched companies, we detect 5% more threats than CrowdStrike does. That's going to be a tough one to sell. Because they're gonna probably catch up with you. I get pitched this all the time. Like, there's a whole set of vulnerabilities that Tenable doesn't cover. I'm like, I think if Tenable had to cover them, they would. They cover a lot of vulnerabilities. So you have to understand, like, when you have a magnitude and why you're worth changing, and changing that value and
how sticky
cyber.
How sticky is that problem that you're solving? Yeah, totally. How much you want to switch into the OT side?
Sure.
What has your investment thesis been for OT to date, and how do you see that changing?
Yeah, so when I started at Tenable, if we had a company from an IT point of view
Yeah.
that was like 100,000 nodes, we priced our stuff based on that. But then, here's the OT stuff. Well, back in early 2000, it might have been 1,000 nodes. It didn't make sense to charge separate for that. But now I talk to companies where if they have a 100,000 node IT network, they probably another 100,000 kind of nodes in the cloud, and another 100,000 OT nodes, right? So it's dramatically changed, and that's one of the reasons you've seen rises to other asset management companies besides Tenable, right? So you Zonius, Dragos, and all these different ways of looking at OT. So when it comes to us as investors, we haven't seen a lot of stuff that we wanted to jump in, right? There have been a lot of like sort of these SD-WAN, let's wrap an enclave around the OT thing, which again, that's what I'm talking about. But just in practice, I haven't seen a lot of OT people want to deploy them. So we haven't done an investment. We did do one investment, which is a one-way data diode in a company called Fend. Fend was recently acquired, but it was basically on one side, it could talk FTP, SNMP, NetFlow, that kind of stuff. And on the other side, it would send it out over an optical link that was one way. And so that was a really cool tech that we did. We've looked at other companies that they try to bring IT to OT. Like can I do maybe it's too disruptive to an OT network to add firewalls. Maybe I can just do ACLs, on the routers that are there. So we've looked at a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, interesting. I can't help but to think that AI is already being leveraged on a lot of the security controls that are already in place for industrial, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this takes shape, especially in that force multiplier, because that's one of the challenges that I personally see is maybe you have a director for OT security for a global fleet of sites, and they're really trying to build that network of relationships internally within that organization. That's where I do think that there's some really interesting opportunities to make these folks more efficient in accomplishing the mission and building out a program.
I think that's true. And I think another thing that's going to be more interesting, if you look at the current administration, Trump administration, they've put out a lot of executive orders, but one of the ones they put out is basically said that, look, cyber is going to be something handled locally at the states, and right on par with weather and natural disasters. They want the states to be funded to respond. And I think anybody who's an OT who's doing power generation, water generation, roadways, bridges, that kind of stuff, it's going to impact them. So what I said before about if you think you have your act together and you're not ready to testify that at your state, capital that you have your act together, be ready for that, because I think the public really wants one. First of all, you should get the credit for it. Like if you're delivering this OT service with like 1,000% uptime or whatever it is, you should get credit for that, right? Enough people here do not understand why the lights stay on, right? And why the water flows, right? It just happens, right? So we are part of society, and we kind of have to take credit for the work that we're doing. But at the same time, this stuff can be politicized. So Salt Typhoon going after the routers in the cloud, Volt Typhoon going after the water generation ports and things like that. Politicians are going to start answering or asking questions, and I think it's going to be up to us professionals to have a professional response to these political answers. And that's probably going to be more impactful to the people on this call than whether or not they deploy AI that's in there. But they got to really stay on top of these issues.
No, I 100% agree with that. And what I detest FUD personally, the whole fear, uncertainty down. I really prefer, value-based discussions. And often it's what I'm focusing on is really helping to make that business case for investment for OT, because, one thing that's really interesting, if you just look at the basics of a manufacturing company, your mission and your purpose for existence is to create a product, transport it to a point of sale, and sell that product. Everything else, every other role within that company is there to support that mission. So, that's sometimes we just have to take a step back and ensure that we're securing that mission and your purpose for existence. It's really that.
But the best way to do that is by gaining people's trust, is by communicating about these things. Trust is earned; it's not given. And if you're doing a great job, be transparent. I think a lot of times I've stereotypically run into not just OT people but IT people. They're afraid that I said I'm secure, but we're missing this firewall, we're missing this tech over here. If you're not transparent, then man, it's never going to be fixed.
You lose critical opportunities to learn from gaps, quite frankly. So listen, I love this Blade Runner reference that we've had today. So maybe on that theme, thinking about maybe it's a 2030. What does 5 years look like? Do you even put out a guess of what 2030 looks like, Ron?
Well, assuming that aliens don't land in New Jersey and I think the normal course of action here is that you're going to see in the next 5 years AI employees. I don't know if they're going to have human rights. I don't know if what jobs they're going to do, but they're going to be introduced, right? They're going to start with being an agent for you. And next thing you know, it's going to be, that kind of stuff. So the question is then, who is going to use that? Are the states going to respond and say, you've got to pay a human the wage of it's going to get really interesting once people start losing their jobs to AI or corporations become more efficient, right? And we get cheaper goods. It's going to be really interesting. So will there be protests? Could you see Occupy Wall Street movements again, sort of going after these AI things? And then the question is when are the robots coming? I think the AI stuff's going to happen first because it's easy to do it. We all work online. If I have a plumber come to my house, when's that plumber going to show up with a robot plumber? I think that's a lot further away. If you look at Waymo and any of these automatic cars, we put such a higher standard of being perfect on these robots and these automated vehicles than we do humans. Even though they've demonstrated that they're better drivers than humans, they mess up once and it's a national story. So it's just we might be very slow as a nation to bring the robots out. And then look, as far as cyber goes, we know how to secure these networks. We just choose not to. So it's really on us to educate our business owners and the leaders out there what we could be doing to make things better. And I really think it's a crapshoot if ransomware goes down, goes up. I think anybody who tells you otherwise doesn't understand the incentives of what's going on out there. If we do get in a shooting war in Europe or China, I really don't think it's going to spill over. Unless you're obviously supporting the war effort, I don't think there's going to be a lot of hacking against the American people. But if you want to see what that might look like, check out 0 Day on Netflix, which I thought was a very potentially realistic situation of what could happen if the nation had a major cyber attack.
Yeah, 100%. I haven't checked that out yet, but I will definitely check that one out. It's on my list. One thing you brought up about having AI agents and replacing employees. So I saw it really interesting. I think it was Founders Table, the startup in Australia, that they had a nice exit in a previous startup, and in this new one, what their intent is building out an AI organization. So you had HR, finance, where you have these chief agents with bot agents underneath, where it's all delegation. My first instant, and it was like a lucid chart video diagram. It really done really well, right? And my first thought was, wow, that's fascinating. And I couldn't help but to think technically how they're implementing it. But then I paused to think, wait a second, those organizations are such a human construct. Why put those constructs on AI? So
yeah, it's going to be really interesting how that all rolls out.
Yeah, so I think my point is, I think there's people that are already working on that. So it's a rapid in a change. It's just beyond any kind of type of hype curve that I've seen. But I think it's understanding and having the willingness to keep the human in the loop. And I think as a key takeaway message to the folks listening today is even with all these advancements in technology, doing the basics, the frameworks that we have available to us today, they'll work. We just have to execute and implement, right? If we're doing the basics, we can actually reduce that risk to an acceptable level. I think it's having the right information to make informed decisions. But
yeah, absolutely. And if you're in cyber, identifying what's preventing your company from being in that state, because if you're playing whack-a-mole, you're below the cyber poverty line, right? If you don't have hygiene and hunting, you are not going to be able to defend your network, and trying to convince people otherwise is tough. It can be tough. They don't have the budget sometimes.
Ron, awesome conversation. Really, really glad that you were able to join us today. Really appreciate your time, insights, and just hearing your story.
Roger, thank you so much, and thanks for the questions. Look, anybody who wants to learn more, the Gula Tech Adventures is the YouTube channel. Gula.tech's the website. Pretty active on LinkedIn. Very responsive. If you have friends who are starting companies, thinking about starting companies, we got a whole video series on stuff like that. And for everybody out there working in OT, keeping the lights on, the water flowing, and the bridges going up and down, you don't get enough credit. And I think we got to be more public about our role in society. And look, if you need help defending from a Chinese attack, and or vendors who aren't being responsive, we can do better as an industry. But you're at the front line of this fight, and keep it up.
100%. Thank you once again, Ron. Kara, over to you.
Thank you for joining us today. What a great webinar. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. If you had a question that we didn't get around to, please feel free to send me a LinkedIn message or go to hillstrongsecurity.com or gula.tech. Thanks again, and remember, we do these webinars every month, so we'll see you next time. Have a great day.